This is Collin Kettell with Palisade Radio. On the line with us today is a new guest to the program, Louis James. Louis is the Chief Metals and Mining Strategist with Casey Research. Louis, thanks for joining us.
Nice to be here.
We just saw each other in Dallas for the Stansberry Mining Conference, where you gave a talk to the audience. Now, typically you speak about mining and metals, but the topic of your speech last weekend came as a bit of a surprise to the audience, and that was Puerto Rico. You now live on the beach in Puerto Rico and are taking advantage of a pretty incredible opportunity that has arisen. Can you briefly tell our listeners about that?
Sure. First, I should say that it's not such a surprise if you think about what I do for Casey Research, and that is due diligence. I'm the guy who goes out and kicks the rocks in the projects and tries to make sure that our investment ideas in metals and mining check out, or that we've seen things before the market has. So when the opportunity arose, or we became aware of the opportunity in Puerto Rico, I was the due diligence guy. I immediately came down here, checked it out. I speak Spanish, so that wasn't an issue. But it turns out you really don't need to speak Spanish in San Juan. And all the restaurants and all the service industry, they're used to English-speaking people. So it was interesting, and I got to tell you the truth. I was already thinking about moving anyway. So I know that something like the idea of picking up and going to Puerto Rico for tax advantages, it's exciting, but it's also really hard. It's a big step for a lot of people. And for me, it sounds like I just did it at the drop of a hat, but I was already thinking of expatriating or moving to warmer climes anyway. And so when I became aware of the tax incentives here, it was just a no-brainer. All that was required was for my wife to approve, and when we came down to check it out, she really loved it. So it was a decision very easy to make.
Talk to our listeners about the tax advantages that are available. I know there's two different sections of the law. One of them pertains to capital gains on an individual level, and the other one is for corporate taxes if you open up a Puerto Rican company.
Right. Well, there are actually several more, and that's important because what it really tells us is the government here is determined to incent businesses that really create jobs or create economic, drive the economy upwards and forwards to come to Puerto Rico. And they're quite serious about it, and there have been past efforts like this. They incented the pharmaceutical guys some years ago with tax advantages, and that was a big wave here in the past, and they're doing it now. And yes, for individuals, however, the big ones are Act 20 and Act 22. Act 22 is the one that applies merely to individuals, and all you have to do to take advantage of that benefit is move here. And if you move here and you apply for Act 22 benefits, then you get a zero capital gains tax contract, really, with the government for a specified period of time. I received mine in the mail after applying, downloading the form online, applying. I got mine in the mail in a month, and I have right there in bold capital letters, zero capital gains tax until 2036. So it was very easy. It's worth stressing that this is Puerto Rican capital gains, and that doesn't restrict you as much as you might think. It's not just buying and selling houses in Puerto Rico, but that is true. If I were to sell the house I just bought at a gain, I would have no tax on that. It also applies to my stock investments because my gains domicile for those is my residency, and that's an IRS rule, not just a Puerto Rican rule. So that's huge for me as a person who plays the markets and has a lot of my pokers in the fire are in equities right now, betting on metals going up again. It's an enormous thing for me to be able to have a tax basis starting in 2014, and any gains that I get going forward will have a zero tax on them for all my equity investments. So that's very good. It does not apply to dividends outside of Puerto Rico, and there are nuances that people really need to get familiar with. But the basic is very simple. If you move here as an investor, it's a really sweet deal. There is no lower tax in the world, and there is no jurisdiction other than a U.S. territory like this that could offer this to U.S. citizens. That's particularly important. If you're Canadian or Swiss or something, the government doesn't follow you and tax you wherever you go.
Talk to us about Act 20, which deals with individuals setting up corporations within Puerto Rico.
Well, actually, it deals with corporations in Puerto Rico that export services. Individuals can set up corporations, but it doesn't have to be. And by the way, Puerto Ricans can take advantage of this too. You don't have to be a stranger coming to take advantage of the tax advantages. Basically, they would like to see the quality job creation here. And why should the U.S. export all its service jobs to India or someplace like that when they have someplace closer to home still inside the country? So anybody that exports services has a shot at Act 20 benefits, and those are very generous. If you qualify after Act 20, your corporate earning can be taxed as low as 3 or 4%, and that's huge. So as an individual, if you set up a corporation that exports services and apply and get approved, you'll still have to pay yourself a base salary. It's not a totally free ticket. You have to pay yourself a reasonable salary for what you do. But as the owner of the company, then the company's profit get paid back to you as dividends or your corporate earnings, and then get that low tax. So it's actually available to companies large and small. It's available to individuals, but it's all about creating a Puerto Rican company. You can't apply as an individual to do it. You have to create a Puerto Rican company. But the benefits are enormous for those whose work is of a type that qualifies. And this could be architects, engineers, writers like me, anybody who could conceivably export their services from Puerto Rico. And that's what I export my writing services to Casey Research in Vermont.
It makes perfect sense that Casey Research is talking about Puerto Rico's new tax advantages at this time, because as a junior mining investor, something you just mentioned and you touched on in your talk, after years of losses, now is a great time to lock in that zero capital gains, because as anybody in the junior sector knows, when these things move, there's no other sector that you will get as bad of capital gains taxes, because you could make that much money. I want to point out that the United States is the only country in the world that taxes its citizens on a worldwide income, as well as a small country in Africa. There are some unique tax strategies to employ that will lighten one's tax burden, but Puerto Rico offers the only capital gains free scenario for U.S. investors. Why has Puerto Rico been able to implement this tax without resistance from the United States?
It's actually pretty simple. It was easy to do because Puerto Ricans are already exempt from U.S. federal income tax, or Puerto Rican income is exempt from U.S. federal income tax. And it's been that way for more than 100 years. So they haven't actually changed anything with regard to the IRS. The difference is that before, it didn't really matter because Puerto Rico had its own taxes that were just as bad. But now, with these incentives that they've put in place, they've basically unilaterally lowered their taxes, and the IRS hasn't done anything. And so the net result is that if you can not just redefine, we're not playing games here, this is real. This is not a tax dodge. This is a legitimate and legal move you can make, and it has to be real. So if you have to move here, you have to live here in at least 6 months and a day and spend most of your time in Puerto Rico and be a Puerto Rican and contribute to the economy here. That's what it's all about. But if you do that, then they're willing to give you an enormous incentive. And as you say, what better time than near the bottom in the resource sector? If Rick Rule and Doug Casey and all these guys are right, even that Louis James fellow from Casey Research, we should see enormous gains going forward in the right companies in the resource sector. And, what a shame to have to share those winnings with the government.
Now that you've been living in Puerto Rico for a few months, what can you tell our listeners about the quality of life? You've already said speaking Spanish is not a requirement. How's living down there?
It's a mixed basket. I have to be honest here, and I wouldn't want anybody to show up and say, oh, you misled me. You told me this was paradise. It's sort of like paradise with trash bags blowing in the wind, if you will, to be honest. It is America's little slice of the third world. So I'm looking out the window right now, and I see palm trees blowing in the wind, Caribbean blue waves splashing on the beach. There's surfers out there right now, so it's wonderful. But if I look a little bit to the right, I also see some cracked pavements. And if I were to go outside and go a block to the right, away from the beach, I'd run into some panhandlers and broken sidewalks. This is the way it is. There's the good, the bad, and the ugly here. What I tell people is, you can look at the pictures, but you can't really know what it's like until you come here. You need to come, spend a week, roll around in it, see what you think. If it's not for you, then maybe it's not worth it. But if you like it, then the tax advantages just make it a no-brainer in my view. It's wonderful. And personally, I travel a lot. I've seen a lot. A little bit of cracks in the sidewalk doesn't really bother me. Doesn't faze me much. And the other alternative, of course, is the gated communities. There's some very nice gated communities that are pristine, manicured. You won't see one sign of grunge or grime anywhere. But you're living in a bubble when you do that. I don't mean financial bubble, of course. I mean you're living in some sort of secluded, isolated setting that way.
Well, I reside in Guatemala City, and we don't have palm trees, tax advantages, or a beach outside my window. So I understand exactly what you mean, and I always tell people to try and move outside of their comfort zone because it's not as bad as people think it might be. Moving over to junior mining, though, you travel the world probably more than 99% of people. You're kicking around rocks in a lot of remote areas. Can you talk about an obscure area that investors may not be aware of, but has you really interested right now?
Well, there are a couple, I suppose. One really interesting area right now is the country of Burkina Faso in central West Africa. There's a lot of skepticism and nervousness about Africa. There's the Arab Spring in northern Africa. There was the Mali coup and subsequent civil war in West Africa. Cote d'Ivoire was a poster child for a safe country for many years, and then it descended into chaos 10 years ago. So many people are nervous about investing in Africa, and rightly so. But of course, that creates opportunities too. There's a discount widely placed on all Africa plays because it's Africa. But all Africa plays are not equal, and at some point, price trumps risk. And if an asset is sufficiently discounted, it's worth a shot in Africa. And right now, Burkina Faso has seen how its neighbor to the south, Ghana, has enormously benefited from the resurgence in metal prices, particularly in gold. Ghana is now the number 2 gold producer in Africa, right after South Africa. And Burkina Faso has the same geology. They say, well, why can't we do that? And they're right. And companies have made discoveries there. The permitting process has been pretty quick. Some companies have gotten, basically from scratch to fully permitted for production in 6 months, which is unheard of almost anywhere else in the world. So it's a place where you can do business now. I have to say there's a significant election coming up at the end of next year, so I'm mostly interested in things with a short fuse right now. But if the country remains stable, it could be a very good place to invest for years to come.
Final question for you. Gold, silver, uranium, copper, or something else, what is your favorite play at this point in the market?
I'm very keen on the platinum group metals right now. I like the precious metals, of course, and most of my investments are in gold plays. But there's a particular leverage right now to the platinum group metals, particularly palladium, more so even than platinum. And you can look at a 6-month palladium chart, and it looks quite striking. And that's because, of course, the troubles in South Africa, the strikes there have already exacerbated a deficit in the platinum and palladium market that currently exists here. It's not just, there might be a supply crunch. The demand that's projected for this year is already well in excess of the supply. And the situation in South Africa, just even if those strikes were resolved tomorrow, it would take months before they could get back to previous levels of production, if they even could. Those are very deep mines, and who knows what's happened kilometers under the ground while nobody's been working there and maintaining it beyond the minimum. And on top of that, there are rumors of troubles with Norilsk. I've talked to friends of mine in the former Soviet space, and they say that with the lack of transparency, it's hard to say exactly what's going on. They hear that there are serious issues within Norilsk, and that's affected both nickel and platinum and palladium. You can see the same thing in the nickel chart, by the way. But I'm more keen on the precious metals and the base metals, and the platinum group metal combine the best of both worlds. You've got the precious metals pricing in there, and also you've got essential industrial metals for which there's an enormous amount of demand and apparently real supply problems.
Louis, thanks so much for joining us. I believe you put out a newsletter on Puerto Rico. Where can our listeners go to get that detailed report on moving to Puerto Rico?
Yeah, if they go to internationalman.com, My boss, Doug Casey, of course, is the original international man. So very simple, all one word, internationalman.com. And there are several buttons there. I think the right-hand column where you can see reports on Puerto Rico or the report on Puerto Rico that you mentioned. And there are probably some free things there you can read and decide whether you want to pay for the in-depth report. But if you're really thinking about this, we're here. We have boots on the ground. We provide links to real estate agents and lawyers who can help. Everything you need to know is in that report.
Great. Thanks so much.
Thank you.